Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today to talk about one of my absolute favorite subjects of all time, the winged wonders that are bats. As mentioned, I'm a wildlife biologist with Midpen Open Space, and my focus is on mammalogy, or the study of mammals, including, of course, bats. So bats are mammals, just like us. They've got hair, just like we do. They're absolutely fascinating. They're often a little bit misunderstood. They're really remarkable in many, many ways. And today we're going to explore the many things that make them so unique amongst mammal fauna. How they support ecosystems, how they help people like you and me, what Midpen does to help protect and support bats in the Bay Area, and finally, what you can do personally to help bats yourselves. We have 15 species of bats here in the Bay Area, believe it or not. And I'm happy to say, if you have any kind of concern about vampire bats, all of the bats that we have in our area are insectivorous, which means they eat insects. There are actually only 3 species of vampire bat, and they all occur in Central and South America. And very, very rarely do they actually feed on humans, so they're not even something to be concerned about if you are not living in the Bay Area. Many of the bats that we have in our area are what are known as mouse-eared bats, or myotis. You can see that we have a variety of myotis species, and these guys are typically very difficult to tell apart. Oftentimes these are called little brown bats, and the identification doesn't go much further than that. We also have some interesting special status species that are known as species of special concern. And this is a designation that basically means that they're being closely watched and monitored by Fish and Wildlife to try and understand what the population is doing and make sure that they don't end up in a situation where they need to become listed as threatened or endangered. So the 3 that we have here that are state species of special concern are the western red bat, the Townsend's big-eared bat, and the pallid bat. Now, why should we care about bats? It's often been said that if you don't like mosquitoes, you should really, really love bats, because a single bat can easily eat 1,000 mosquitoes per night. This can really help with lowering that pest species population number. Now, of course, aside from helping us by eating mosquitoes, they're also really essential part of a healthy ecosystem. They regulate those insect populations. They spread nutrients through their waste, which helps plants to grow, and they are themselves a food source for species like hawks, owls, and falcons, and even things like raccoons. They also eat agricultural pests, and according to Bat Conservation International, the annual insect control that bats provide is worth an estimated 23 billion with a B to U.S. agriculture. So they are our natural insecticide. Now, bats also pollinate plants, like this Mexican long-tongued bat, which doesn't occur here in the Bay Area, but I did want to talk about the benefits of bats, and pollination is a big one. They, in fact, pollinate plants such as the blue agave, which is famous for producing the drink known as tequila. Bats are also culturally important. We've got Bela Lugosi here as Count Dracula, famous folklore of a man that's able to turn into a bat that drinks blood. Now, this is not my favorite portrayal of bats personally, but it's a culturally significant one. I'm actually a bigger fan of this Zapotec bat god from the region that is now known as Oaxaca, Mexico, which is thought to have been an important emissary to the underworld and the spirit ancestors of the Zapotec peoples. Note that prominent kind of horn structure on the forehead. This is very likely a representation of a nose leaf, which is a feature found on certain bat species from the area that eat insects and likely play a large role in agricultural production in that region. And of course, I would be remiss talking about bats without mentioning the Caped Crusader, Batman. And bats are really highly curious creatures. They're always investigating their environment, much like a detective. And the reason for this is that they need to know what areas that they can roost in. So if conditions change or a roost is destroyed, they've got a backup that will support them. And while bats, as far as I know, don't fight crime, there's at least some similarities between them and the famous Batman. So one of the #1 threats to bats is one that many species are facing, and that is habitat loss. So just like most of us here in the Bay Area can really relate to there being a housing shortage, there's also a housing shortage for bats. There's also a food supply shortage that bats are dealing with. Another big issue for bats is a disease known as white nose syndrome. Now this is caused by a fungal pathogen known as Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or PD, that impacts hibernating bats. This fungus does really well in dark, damp caves and impacts bats during their winter hibernation period when they often gather in large groups and then the pathogen is able to spread. This grows on their noses, their faces, and their wings, and it awakens them from their hibernation, causing them to rub at their faces and try to get this fungus off of them. So this is actually thought to be one of the more destructive wildlife pathogens that have ever been recorded and can wipe out up to 90 to 100% of bat populations in areas where it occurs. And unfortunately, white nose syndrome is on the move. Now, collisions with wind turbines is also a leading cause of bat mortality in the US. Luckily, there are many researchers out there that are working on innovative solutions, including adding audio and visual deterrents around wind farms to keep bats from colliding with these turbines. I don't want you to be terrified of bats or afraid of being near bats, but I do want you to definitely know it is not okay to touch bats. Really, don't touch any wildlife, because doing that might put you and the animal at risk. So if you find a bat on the ground, contact your local vector control, or if you're on a Midpen preserve, go ahead and call the number listed in the slide here. And then somebody like myself that has a rabies vaccination can come out and safely remove the bat and relocate it to a wildlife rehabilitation center. Rabies is a very serious disease. It has a near 100% mortality rate. Luckily, you actually have to come in contact with saliva or blood from an infected animal to get this disease. So the easiest way to avoid that risk is to just never touch an animal that may carry the virus. An average of just 2 people a year contract rabies from bats in the United States and Canada. So the risk is exceptionally low as long as you avoid touching bats and other animals that may carry rabies. So how do we study bats at Midpen? Well, some of the more simple surveys, of course, is just trying to find out where they are. So sometimes it could be pretty obvious, like, hey, we built a bat box. Are there going to be any bats in that bat box? But sometimes it could be a little more difficult, like if they're roosting way up high in a tree, in a hollow, or in the foliage of trees. We want to know where bats are so we can help protect them. So this involves basically looking in appropriate habitats for evidence of roosting bats, like urine staining, guano, pieces of insects, cold insect parts, or of course the bats themselves. But it's important to note bat use in habitats fluctuates quite a bit throughout the year and even at different times of the day. So you might not see any bats during the day, but they might be coming in at night, or vice versa. You might have a roost that is active during the day, but at night the bats leave. So you want to make sure that you're surveying at different times under different conditions to really get a sense for use. Now, another way that we study bats is through acoustic monitoring. So we have 2 types of acoustic monitoring that we use. One is active acoustic monitoring, where you get to cosplay as a Ghostbuster, like my friend Karine Tokalian is demonstrating here. And this allows you to get bat data in real time. So as a bat's flying above your head, you're seeing what it's doing and what those acoustic calls look like. The other method is using a passive monitoring setup. So you put a microphone out with a battery bank and a recording unit, and you can leave these out for weeks at a time, and then come in and collect that data. So this is what acoustic data actually looks like when we get it. This is using a program called Sonobat. And each species of bats have a set characteristic echolocation call, and we can look at comparing recordings of identified calls to identify bat species within a certain degree of confidence. So for example, this call here has been analyzed as belonging to Epticus fiscus, which is the big brown bat. All right, so in some circumstances, that acoustic data might not be enough to answer the questions that we have about bats. So if we're interested in things like demographics, how many old and young bats there are, what the sex ratio is, what bats are eating, if there's a maternity roost in an area, which can be really important, then we might need to do what's called misnetting for bats. So as you can see, these nets can be very, very large. This one right here is 20, 30 feet high, which makes them difficult to avoid. So it's not that the bats can't see them, they can detect them, but by the time they do, they don't have much chance to maneuver and get away from them. And oftentimes they'll end up in there. And once we have a bat in the net, we very carefully extract them. And we do our best, of course, to minimize stress to the bats throughout this process and minimize any handling time as much as we possibly can. We can do measurements and look at the forearm length, and we can look at the length of the tragus, the ear length, things like that. And this can be helpful to us in just understanding, general morphology of the bats in the area, but also can help us to identify bats to individual species. We can also weigh bats by wrapping them up in a little piece of nylon and making like a little bat burrito. And then we weigh the bat in the nylon and then weigh the nylon without the bat and subtract. Then we know how much these bats weigh. The most important way that we protect bats is actually, of course, through preservation of habitat. And I'll talk a little bit about work we do that's associated with man-made structures as well, but the most important habitat for bats comes from healthy ecosystems that provide structure for bats roosting, usually outside of man-made buildings. That varies a bit from species to species. Here's a few of the projects I'd like to highlight. These are some large cinder block bat structures that were designed by Dave Johnston and Kim Briones from HD Harvey and Associates to provide roosting opportunities for both crevice roosting bats and cave roosting species like that Townsend's big-eared bat. Huge shout out here to our Midpen crew who built these structures out at Bear Creek Redwoods to give bats a place to roost following the removal of some of the structures at the former Alma College. Here we have one of the historic structures at Alma College that was not removed. In fact, it's been maintained and modified as part of our cultural preservation in the area, but also to support bats. And our crew went in and with the design from HD Harvey, worked to seal off these structures with cinder blocks, creating a really nice, warm, cave-like environment for bats. And we also have crevice roosting structures. You see bat boxes on the exterior of the building and some on the inside as well. And they even put up corrugated metal sheeting to block light from entering inside the building to keep it nice and dark inside. And we have entrances that the bats are able to come and go through. So I'd like to kind of conclude now in talking about how you can help bats. So here we see a big brown bat roosting in just a ½ inch crevice, which is like the perfect spot for them. They love that kind of thing. And if you're a homeowner, you may have had bats take up residence in your home in situations like this. And you might not be so keen on that, which, that's understandable. But, if you are not so keen on living close to bats in this way, I just really have to advocate, just try to avoid removing bats during those sensitive periods. So the winter torpor and the summer maternity roost season. And if you are going to contract out with a company to remove bats, try to make sure that they're not utilizing lethal removal strategies. They're using non-lethal strategies to safely let the bats leave on their own. And then seal the structure so that they're not able to come back. Well, the other thing that you can do, of course, is to actually provide habitat for bats. So maybe you don't want bats roosting right in the walls of your house, but you'd like to have them around so that they can keep mosquitoes down and maybe even make some nice fertilizer for your garden. So if you're interested in that, you can put up something like this. A nice bat box. Other things that can support bats is to plant trees. And if you happen to have property with a lot of acreage on it, that has maybe some older snags, dead trees that have a lot of cavities and exfoliating bark, try to retain those if you can, and if it's safe to do so, because those are going to support bats more than live trees often can. If you are able, if you have the privilege to be able to afford organic foods, try to purchase those, and that way we're cutting down on insecticide use and helping with that food shortage that bats are dealing with. And then you can also follow and support organizations like Bat Conservation International and the Merlin Tuttle Institute. But lastly, and I can't emphasize this enough, most importantly, just talk to your friends and your family about bats. What makes them so great, what makes them cool, what makes them fascinating, and just become a bat ambassador. Help spread the understanding and dispel misconceptions about bats. And that's probably one of the most important things you can possibly do.